President-elect Donald Trump still tweeting, even now that he's about to be the leader of the free world. He says he'll make some big decisions soon about the people who will help him run the government. Now we're learning more about the contenders for some of the top jobs in the White House. And we have new details about the future commander-in-chief's intelligence briefings. We'll also look at how much Democrats can do to block the Trump agenda in the Senate and where they might actually work with the new president. That's all ahead this hour. I'm John Scott in for Shepard Smith. First from the Fox News deck, the future Trump White House. The president-elect today tweeted he has a busy day planned in New York, and he will soon be making some, quote, very important decisions about the people who will be running our government. He also just announced a shakeup in his transition team. Vice President-elect Mike Pence will take over as chairman from New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. This is the first hint of how much power the Indiana governor might have as vice president. Helping him on the transition team are people who might end up on the cabinet. They include members of the president-elect's inner circle, Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner, Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Chris Christie, Newt Gingrich, Rudy Giuliani, and Dr. Ben Carson. They also include Trump campaign chairman Stephen Bannon, RNC chair Reince Priebus, Trump campaign manager Kellyanne Conway, Silicon Valley billionaire Peter Thiel, and dozens of others. More on that in a moment. Meantime, President-elect Trump is also preparing for his new role on the global stage. The New York Times reports he's set to meet with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in New York on Thursday. During the campaign, the president-elect accused Japan and other American allies of not paying, quote, their fair share to support American military bases overseas. He suggested Japan might be better off if it protects itself against North Korea. He also slammed the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal between the U.S., Japan, and other nations. President-elect Trump's meeting with Prime Minister Abe could give us clues about the Trump administration's foreign policy agenda. Presidents Obama and Clinton met with Mexican presidents after winning the White House. President George W. Bush met with the French president, and Bush 41 and President Ronald Reagan both met with West German chancellors. We have Team Fox coverage. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has more on President-elect Trump's intelligence briefings. First, though, to Peter Doocy, live in Washington, covering the transition. Peter.
And John, it doesn't sound like there's any bad blood behind this Christie demotion, because Trump is actually thanking the New Jersey governor who lives across the river. He just released this statement where he mentions that Pence is going to be aided in the transition effort by Carson, Gingrich, Flynn, Giuliani, and Sessions. And then he adds this, quote, together, this outstanding group of advisors led by Vice President-elect Mike Pence will build on the initial work done under the leadership of New Jersey Governor Chris Christie to help prepare a transformative government ready to lead from day one. There's also a lot of noise this afternoon around the idea of Reince Priebus leaving the RNC and joining Trump's administration as chief of staff. And this morning, he explained all the buzz like this.
Number one, that's not my job. Number two, I don't have any updates for you on transition. I'm sitting here at the RNC, and it's a great job, and that's the one I'm doing, and I love it.
There still haven't been any staffing or cabinet announcements, but Trump says that he is working on all of that today in Manhattan. John.
Any update on what the president-elect and Republican leaders are working on in Congress?
There is a way to cut taxes, according to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who we just heard from a few hours ago.
I think he's very interested in tax reform. If you're talking about the way we levy things, whether it's tariffs or income taxes or whatever. My assumption is we'll deal with taxes in a comprehensive way.
Trump has been calling world leaders and setting up bilateral meetings as well, but a few minutes ago, the president of the EU Commission said he thinks Trump's election may negatively affect U.S. and European relations, so there may be another name on the list of Trump phone calls during the transition. John.
Peter Doocy. Thanks, Peter. Well, now that Donald Trump is the next president of the United States, he has access to the same classified information President Obama sees on a daily basis. The White House says administration officials will give President-elect Trump the same intelligence briefings they give our current commander-in-chief. Now we're learning more about how those briefings work and when they might start. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge live in Washington. Catherine, officials laid the groundwork for this months ago, huh?
Well, that's on. Two intelligence sources tell Fox News the president's daily brief, known as the PDB, is now available to President-elect Trump. But there's no expectation at this time that the briefings will begin until next week at the earliest. And in late summer, the White House told the intelligence community to give the winner full access to the PDB, which is like a highly classified newspaper of the day's most pressing events, to ensure a smooth transition of power.
The intelligence community has made those briefings available. I don't know whether the president-elect, the vice president-elect, and their national security designees have actually received the briefing.
PDB has to be done in a secure facility. They often refer to these as SCIFs. Fox News is told that there is a dedicated transition space near the White House, which can be used by the president-elect for these briefings on the PDB. In New York, he would need to travel to a secure federal facility, such as the FBI headquarters, which he used for the briefings as a candidate, John.
So how are these briefings different from the ones he got when he was just a candidate?
Well, there's really a very significant difference between the briefings for candidates and the briefings received by the president. The candidate's brief is really like a primer to help bring them up to speed on topics such as China, Iran, or ISIS. The candidates throughout the cycle have been free to request additional briefs on topics of interest, and those additional briefs were then shared with their opponents. So, for example, if candidate Trump wanted a special brief on ISIS, the same ISIS brief would then be offered to Mrs. Clinton. The PDB is really like this highly classified newspaper, as I mentioned before, and it only contains the most credible intelligence. There's a very high threshold for the intelligence to be included. And it's important to note that President Obama is the first president to routinely take the PDB electronically on his iPad. This is a dramatic break from past practice, which included in-person briefings usually conducted by the CIA. Because the idea behind the PDB is that it's an engagement with the president that really drives questions for the briefer and follow-up taskings for the intelligence community. And what briefers often say is that when they've been in to see the president, they often have a laundry list afterwards of things on their to-do list to follow up with the IC. And what we don't know at this point, John, is whether President Trump is going to do it in the same way as Mr. Obama, or whether he will go back to that standard practice of getting the briefing in person, like I said, this engagement, which is what we've seen before.
Fascinating. One of the aspects of the job we don't hear that much about.
Yeah, not much, actually, but it is really interesting.
Thanks, Catherine Herridge.
You're welcome.
We are fewer than 70 days now from Donald Trump taking the oath of office, and the president-elect says it cannot come soon enough. Ahead, we'll talk with Fox News anchor Chris Wallace about Trump's promises for day one in the White House and how the first 100 days might play out. Well, like all candidates, President-elect Donald Trump made lots of promises on his way to winning the White House. Starting 10 weeks from today, we will see if he can deliver. Last month, the president-elect laid out a plan for his first 100 days in office, a so-called contract with the American voter. Some of the major items: cancel every, quote, unconstitutional executive action President Obama has issued, begin removing more than 2 million, quote, criminal illegal immigrants from the U.S., overhaul trade deals, including NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, begin planning for the wall along the border with Mexico, and work with Congress to repeal and replace President Obama's signature health care law. On top of all that, President-elect Trump promises to, quote, drain the swamp and get rid of corruption in Washington. Let's bring in Chris Wallace, anchor of Fox News Sunday. It is quite a list, Chris. Where do you guess he begins?
Well, I think he begins with the easy parts, and the easiest one is executive actions. You know, for most of the last 4 years, Barack Obama gave up working with Congress and did stuff by, as he'd like to say, I have a pen and a phone. And with a pen, he was able to do a lot of executive actions on climate change, on deferring deportation of millions of people in this country illegally. The flip side of all those executive actions is that they can all be undone with the stroke of a pen. And so on his first day, Donald Trump could sit at that desk in the Oval Office and undo every one of Barack Obama's executive orders. So that'll be, I think, the first thing he does. And that'll be able to rack up some victories in terms of his promises on immigration and on climate change. Then you know he's going to make a conservative appointment to the Supreme Court. I'm sure they'll have a confirmation battle on that, but chances are he'll be able to get it through. That'll be another big one for conservatives. And then Obamacare, repealing Obamacare. And even there, he has a kind of easy road because of the fact through budget reconciliation, it's part of the budget process, they can take action without having to face a Democratic filibuster in the Senate. So they may well be able to repeal that in the first 100 days. So he can actually accomplish a lot. And if he were to do just the things that I said, and that wouldn't get us to undoing the nuclear deal with Iran or building the wall, that would be a lot of victories and a lot of campaign promises that would be kept.
That budget reconciliation device is the method that Democrats used to get the whole thing passed in the first place, right?
That's exactly right. So many of these things that Obama used, executive actions, reconciliation, to put forth his agenda, are things that Donald Trump can now use to take a wrecking ball to Obama's agenda.
So then some of the trade deals, for instance, the TPP, that hasn't been signed yet, correct? He can basically just ignore it and let it wither on the vine.
That's dead. You've got to remember, Hillary Clinton also said she wasn't going to approve that. There is zero chance that the TPP will go through. It's somewhat more complicated to renegotiate the trade deals with NAFTA and some of the others that already exist. But the Pacific Trade Partnership, gone.
So we know that he's going to have this meeting coming up with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. How does that meeting go? I mean, he has been very critical, as you've heard throughout the campaign season, of Japan and accusing that country of not carrying its own weight when it comes to its own defense.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see. There are a lot of things that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail, the sort of blustery, boisterous Donald Trump, and one questions whether he is going to do all of those things. There almost are two Trump personalities, and we've seen them this week. You have, as I say, the blustery candidate Trump, and then you have the much more disciplined, much more quiet, much more sober President Trump that we saw just yesterday walking around Washington. And I think that some of the things that he promised on the campaign trail are going to go by the wayside. I think you'll see him be somewhat more conciliatory to our allies, maybe a little tougher on some enemies like Russia. And, you know, it'll be interesting to see. One of the promises he made on the campaign trail is he was going to appoint a special prosecutor to relaunch the investigations into Hillary Clinton. Given the fact that he won, she lost, and he's got to do some business with congressional Democrats, especially in the Senate where they have the filibuster, I would be very surprised if he does that.
What about the wall? That was perhaps his most prominent promise on the campaign trail, but there are an awful lot of thorny issues that come up, including the fact that something like 2/3 of the land between, that separates the United States and Mexico belongs either to the state of Texas or private landowners.
Well, that's right. That's going to be a complicated one. That's why I didn't mention it in the beginning as an early one. And it was interesting. Bret Baier interviewed Paul Ryan last night on Special Report, and he asked him several times about building a wall. And Ryan kind of flipped that or morphed that into securing the border. So I think you might see a physical wall for part of it, but I get the feeling, there are a lot of complications in that regard. And my guess is that, that won't be a physical wall for the whole 1,000+ miles, that there'll be some areas where it's virtual or beefing up Border Patrol. But in effect, they will use a variety of technological means and also brick and mortar to secure the border in a way that they haven't before. And I think, again, looking at what Ryan said, I think deportation, and Trump also suggested this, will take a backseat. That the first thing he'll do, and again, I think it's the kind of a thing that would satisfy a lot of people if he were to secure the border one way or another and have people feel that we really aren't going to let new illegal immigrants, a new wave come in,
sure,
then there might be a more rational conversation about what we do with the people who are already here.
And there are a lot of those bad hombres, as he called them, out there. I mean, there are, gang members, peddling drugs in the inner cities of this country who came in from, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, places like that.
Absolutely. And that part of it I do think he will keep, which is the deportation of people who have committed more crimes since they came into this country. I think he'll absolutely follow through on that.
All right. Chris Wallace. Chris, thank you. This weekend on Fox News Sunday, Chris talks with former Trump campaign manager Kellyanne Conway, who is now a senior advisor to the president-elect. They will have an awful lot to talk about, as you can imagine. Also, the House Majority Leader, California Republican Congressman Kevin McCarthy, That's this Sunday on your local Fox station. Check the TV listings for when it runs in your area. Outgoing Democratic Senator Harry Reid is going off on Donald Trump and some of the Americans who voted for him. His incendiary words are at odds with all the top Democrats in his party. We'll tell you what Harry Reid has to say. Plus, the Hillary Clinton campaign seems to be in complete denial about how they lost the presidency and both houses of Congress. So what's next for the Democrats who actually have to work with the president-elect? Some of the most liberal members of the party are speaking out, and what they are saying might surprise you. That's next. Well, Donald Trump's election has thrown Democrats into chaos, revealing divisions within the party. Hillary Clinton's campaign aides held a conference call with their surrogates late yesterday. We're told they blamed the devastating loss on everything but themselves. Reportedly, they said their candidate was great and so was their strategy. Instead, the aides say the loss was the fault of the media, sexism, and FBI Director James Comey. Regardless of their spin, there's a big question about how Democrats will take on a new Republican president and majorities in the House and Senate. Liberal Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who openly feuded with Trump during the campaign, extended an olive branch in a post-election statement. It reads in part, quote, "President-elect Trump promised to rebuild our economy for working people, and I offer to put aside our differences and work with him on that task." Outgoing Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid had a completely different take, though. In a statement, he writes, quote, "I have personally been on the ballot in Nevada for 26 elections, and I have never seen anything like the reaction to the election completed last Tuesday. The election of Donald Trump has emboldened the forces of hate and bigotry in America. White nationalists, Vladimir Putin, and ISIS are celebrating Donald Trump's victory, while innocent, law-abiding Americans are racked with fear. Especially African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Muslim Americans, LGBT Americans, and Asian Americans, watching white nationalists celebrate while innocent Americans cry tears of fear does not feel like America." Joining us now, Capri Cafaro, a Democratic member of the Ohio State Senate. What do you think about what Harry Reid had to say?
I mean, those are some pretty strong words, to say the least. I know that tensions are very high right now by many in the Democratic Party, many that did not support Donald Trump. Frankly, the Republicans as well that, were not necessarily on Team Trump throughout this process. While I understand where Harry Reid is coming from, this is a time where we really do need to unite. You saw Elizabeth Warren, obviously, you mentioned her, and there are a number of others that are going to try to give Donald Trump a chance. This is the Democratic electoral process, and as much as some of us may not like it, we have to move forward and we have to figure out a way to govern.
President Obama was gracious in his remarks. Hillary Clinton was gracious in her remarks.
Absolutely.
Should that not set the tone for the party?
You would hope so, but what we've seen over the last year or so is take, for example, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders went out there and said, the primaries are over. I'm supporting Hillary Clinton. You guys that followed me need to follow her, and nobody listened to him either. So, we do have a lot of soul searching to do within the Democratic Party to find our voice again, to have a cohesive message and strategy, because this did not happen overnight.
So as you examine what happened, this is a woman who Barack Obama said was the most qualified candidate ever to be president of the United States. Why did she not win?
I think because, the American electorate was not necessarily being convinced or swayed by, a resume necessarily. They wanted change. For example, we just lost 1,200 jobs in my district, General Motors, just this week. And I just got notice that we have lost, they're going to be planning layoffs at our major hospital system as well. So, there was an absolute disconnect, frankly, between the mood of the electorate, particularly in the middle of the country, and the views of sort of the elite class, if you will, the tastemakers on the coasts.
Bill Clinton, who has his finger on the pulse of the American voter better than just about anybody
Absolutely.
I've ever seen, was privately complaining to the campaign that, hey, you are not reaching out to the sort of downtrodden middle-class voter in your part of the country.
Absolutely.
Who are hurting for jobs.
No question. I think that there was, again, because the message was muddled through the primary, there was a lot of, for it before you're against it, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. And the people in my district remembered that. My home county, which has voted Democrat in pretty much every single election, voted for Donald Trump, a Republican, for the first time since Herbert Hoover. If that doesn't tell you something, I don't know what does. People want to be listened to. They don't want to be talked down to. And I think that folks felt that they needed a drastic change so they could actually feel some change for themselves and for the country.
You're thinking about changing parties?
No, but I am term limited, so I only have about 49 days left in office. So.
All right. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, maybe in a change election, that long resume and all that time in Washington didn't sell.
Absolutely.
Capri Cafaro.
Thank you.
Well, Donald Trump was a presidential candidate like no other, tweeting, fighting, insulting his opponents on the campaign trail. But how will he act once he's sworn into office? We're getting some hints from his books, as well as his former and current employees. More on that ahead. A Fox Report now. More of today's headlines from the Fox News deck. Crews in Alabama put out a huge fire at a petroleum equipment facility near Mobile. They got it under control pretty fast and nobody's hurt, but the fire sent smoke and flames high into the air. Environmental officials say they are checking to make sure the runoff did not contaminate waters nearby. Secretary of State John Kerry is making a historic visit to Antarctica. Kerry is the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit the icy continent. He's there to meet with scientists and discuss the impact of climate change. Kerry has made the issue a priority during his time as Secretary of State. And a fitting story to end this election season. Two bald eagles got into a scuffle in Orlando, Florida. The fight apparently over territory. At some point, one of the birds got stuck in a storm drain. Crews were able to free the bird, which is expected to be fine. The news continues right after this. President-elect Donald Trump might have to adapt to some big changes when he transitions from running his company to leading our country. Analysts say the billionaire's tendency to rely on a small circle of trusted execs is going to have to change. As president, he will have a lot more people advising him. Still, those analysts say they expect Trump to bring his own leadership style to the White House. People who've worked closely with him told the Washington Post the president-elect cannot stand long meetings, and he rarely sticks to a schedule. They say he barely does any reading, and he makes quick decisions based on his gut instincts. Kristen Tate is a contributor to the political website The Hill. She's author of the book Government Gone Wild. So what are the big changes private citizen Trump is going to have to make when he takes over the White House?
Well, look, I think Trump is going to be a very action and results-oriented president. At the Trump Organization, he employed over 20,000 people. So I think executive experience is really not going to be a problem for him. A problem for him is going to be dealing with bureaucracy. But he can find ways to circumvent bureaucracy to get things done. And as you mentioned, I think one thing he's going to do is surround himself with people he knows and trusts, people with experience that he can turn to for advice. He doesn't really need to learn and retain everything. Trump can focus on big picture issues and kind of delegate smaller tasks to people on his staff, but I would expect him to hold that staff accountable for positive results, just like he does in the private sector.
But it is said that in running his business, he gets involved in micromanaging, choosing the light fixtures, that kind of thing. You can't do that.
He is a perfectionist. He is a perfectionist, but I think he really trusts his inner circle. Trump is a loyal person, and the people who stuck with him in his darkest days, people like, Rudy Giuliani, Chris Christie, these people have experience and he trusts them. So I think he'll be able to focus on the bigger picture.
But the White House staff alone is something like 4,000 people, I want to say, and just you can't have an inner circle that's that big.
Look, he's going to have to make adjustments. He realizes that, I think. And the bottom line is that Trump is a hard worker. Look at what he did in this campaign. He never slept. The guy was campaigning, going to several states per day. He was up all morning until the night campaigning. Hillary Clinton was napping while the press ignored her. So I think Trump is a workaholic, and he's ready to get things done and work with other folks.
Speaking of that, the Wall Street Journal is just out with a story that suggests that Mr. Trump is considering keeping parts of the Affordable Care Act. Now, throughout his campaign, he said we're going to dismantle Obamacare. But apparently a couple of aspects of it, the one that doesn't allow insurers to cancel you if you've got pre-existing condition, and it also allows adult children to stay on their parents' health care plans until they reach the age of 26. Those two things he's talking about keeping. Does that surprise you?
Look, I think the bottom line is that he is going to push towards a more privatized system. Obamacare as a whole does not work. He may keep bits and pieces of it, but as a whole, we will see a more privatized system. I'm very confident in that. I think Trump realizes the folks that got him to the White House, he knows what they want, and he will not let them down. I also think he's going to follow through on his promise promises to secure that border. I think we're going to see him on day one looking at Obama's executive orders and deciding which ones to immediately repeal. This is going to be a man of action. So yes, he may keep bits and pieces of Obamacare, but the fundamentals, it's going to be privatized.
And those two aspects of Obamacare, I remember Republicans have said all along you didn't need to blow up the entire health care system of the country to get 25-year-olds able to stay on their parents' health care plan. You didn't need to blow up the health care system to tell insurance companies that they can't cancel people with pre-existing conditions.
Right, yeah. I mean, there are certain aspects of it that are certainly it sounds like going to be kept. But again, it all comes down to we need competition in the market for our healthcare system. That's how we're going to make quality go up. We cannot have this socialized healthcare single-payer system that someone like Hillary Clinton probably would have put in place.
He has also said a freeze on government hiring. Tell us what that could do for the size of the federal government.
Well, I would like to see President Trump shrink the size of the federal government, and I'm sure a lot of his supporters would as well. I want to see him bring in people without government experience. Chris Christie has said they're going to do that. Now we have Mike Pence obviously in charge of picking people in the cabinet. So this is all about getting back to conservative roots, limiting the size of government, getting fewer people on the government payroll, and bringing in folks who have real-world experience, not just bureaucrats.
All right, but he doesn't have government experience. Does that bother you in any way?
That's one of his biggest assets, and that is why we saw Trump win. The American people know that what's going on in D.C. right now is not working. Hillary Clinton was the epitome of a government bureaucrat, and the American people have spoken. They said, no, we want people with real experience. We want doers. We want someone who's going to take action. So when you bring in some fresh blood, some people who haven't been in government offices for their lives, I think that's going to be something the nation really needs.
All right, Kristen Tate, thanks very much.
Thank you, John.
Former Illinois Congressman Aaron Schock is now facing years in prison on charges he illegally tried to make money off his government job. Schock resigned last year after critics blasted him for the way he spent money. According to prosecutors, the former Republican congressman used tens of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money to redecorate his D.C. office to look like the TV show Downton Abbey. Schock's lawyer says the government is making criminal mountains out of molehills. Quote, it was evident to us from the first day they subpoenaed him that they had every intent to embarrass and humiliate him. Fox News anchor Greg Jarrett is here. He's a former defense attorney. So exactly what are the charges against him?
To put it simply, he is accused of converting campaign funds and taxpayer funds for his own personal use to the tune of $100,000. We can put up some of the charges. These are the formal charges: wire fraud, bank fraud, or mail fraud, theft of government funds, so on and so forth. Essentially, according to the indictment, the feds say donors bought, sold, and financed a house that he owned. He created a front corporation to funnel money into his pocket. The oddest one is that he used campaign funds to buy Super Bowl tickets, a bunch of them, and then he resold them and pocketed $18,000 profit for his own personal use. He reimbursed himself 150,000 more miles than his vehicle traveled, allegedly, and he's accused of trying to get the house to repay him $30,000 for personal camera equipment. So the list is really long. This is like a 52-page indictment that reads like a can you believe it novel.
He was not exactly shy about how he spent money, apparently.
No, and that was his downfall. He was incredibly ostentatious. As you mentioned, he redecorates his office in this opulent Downton Abbey style with these red walls and fancy, expensive paintings, a chandelier made of crystal. He has even a plume of pheasant feathers in there. And questions began to arise. Hey, who's paying for all of this? And then there were the photographs of himself. He had a pension. There's glacier jumping in Patagonia, surfing in Hawaii, dancing the tango in Buenos Aires, private jets, concerts, festivals, European vacations, Super Bowl, World Series, fancy dinners, expensive hotels. And so the media caught on to this. And they started to look into it. They said, wait a minute, this is like a playboy billionaire, but he's a congressman who makes $174,000. So the media looked into it. and they used the date and time codes of the Instagram photographs he posted, comparing to the expense reports. Voila, they found this treasure trove of alleged illegality. The feds caught on, 2 grand juries, now an indictment.
So what's his defense?
His defense is the oops defense. He said, well, it's just a paperwork error and sloppy accounting and so forth. I never intended to break the law. Well, the oops defense works when you make a mistake 2 or 3 times, 24 times, then it becomes a less viable defense. And by the way, intent is not the legal standard. It's knowing and willful. And jurors at the end of the trial get an instruction that says you can infer from the sheer volume willful and knowing. So he's got a tough road here.
So he could go to jail for a long time if he's convicted, huh?
He surely could. I mean, for example, the wire fraud alone carries 20 years. If you get convicted of, say, half of these things, they could run consecutively. Here's a comparison. Rod Blagojevich, who was the former governor of Illinois, he got 14 years. The guy in the center, the powerful New York Assembly, Speaker Sheldon Silver, he got 12 years. The guy on the right, Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, got 28 years. So Aaron Schock may find himself amid some pretty bad company there.
From the house to the big house.
Yeah.
All right. Greg and Jarrett, thank you.
All right, John.
Islamic State fighters have killed about 70 civilians in Mosul just this past week. According to the United Nations, ISIS militants dressed the civilians in orange jumpsuits and hung their bodies from electrical poles in the center of town. But there also are stories of hope and heroism coming out of Iraq. And on this Veterans Day, we'll tell you at least one of them. That's next. United Nations officials say they have new evidence that ISIS militants are using chemical weapons in Iraq's second largest city, Mosul. They say at least 4 people have died from breathing in toxic fumes after ISIS fighters shelled a gas factory last month. UN officials also say the militants have stockpiled lots of ammonia and sulfur, and they can only, quote, speculate about what ISIS might do with the chemicals. As for the fight to take back Mosul, Iraqi forces say the closer they get to the center of the city, the slower they have to move. They say it's to avoid killing civilians and surprise attacks. Now Fox News is getting a look at one American who's on the front lines, even though he is no longer serving in the military. Greg Palcott reports from Erbil, Iraq.
The U.S. is helping in many ways to defeat ISIS here in Iraq. Airstrikes, mine clearing, logistical support. But there is one young American man, among others, who is making it his personal mission to deal with the atrocities inflicted on the people here by the militants.
Meet Pete Reed. He's the guy with the blonde hair. The 27-year-old Bordentown, New Jersey native was a ski instructor, served in the Marines, and learned medical skills. Now he's saving Iraqi soldier and civilian